Okay, as we get ready for Sunday, our lesson this week is on Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. This is where Jacob wrestles with God, wrestles with the pre-incarnate form of Jesus Christ. And I would list the theme of this lesson, really, this passage, as God transforms those who seek Him. But a great discussion question you could start off with, which I'm sure is going to have a lot of maybe disagreement about or whatever, depending on where you land. I'll tell you where I land. But the question to ask would be this: does Jacob's wrestling with God bring about his transformation, as so many people seem to interpret this passage? Or is it a manifestation of a transformation that's already taking place, in the process of taking place? Just like all of us are transformed in one sense at salvation, but we're always in a daily process of becoming more like Christ. So keep that in mind. We'll get back to that in a second. But Jacob has left. The context of this passage is Jacob has left Laban. And of course, there's the whole issue of Laban, tracks him down because there's some stolen idols. Turns out Rachel was hiding them, but Laban doesn't find that out. And by the end of chapter 31, Jacob and Laban have basically reconciled and kind of have established a peace agreement, if you will. However, Esau is another story, at least as far as Jacob knows, and we don't really know when and how Esau changed from wanting to kill Jacob, which is the last time we see Esau. 20 years ago, he wanted to kill Jacob. Jacob fled. And so it's been 20 years later, and as Jacob is traveling back home, Esau is coming to meet him, and the implication is that he's meeting him to enact his revenge, because he's coming with 400 armed warriors, the Bible tells us in verse 6 of chapter 32. And so it's interesting because verses 1 and 2 of this chapter say that angels of God meet Jacob, and that place is called Mahanaim, which means this is God's company, or it can be translated two companies. I think the name, either way you translate it, is emphasizing that God's host is there, and then Jacob has his company, his family. And again, just like the passage where Jacob sees the ladder and the angels ascending and descending, I think this is another encouragement from God that God is with him. So at this point, he's making his journey, and I think we see in the context, now I'm still prior to the passage, I'm in chapter 32, but you've got to look at the context. The context answers these questions. When I ask a question, I'm usually not asking a question that the answer isn't provided in the scripture. And I'm wanting to see if our students are going to look at context to get their answer, which quite often, quite frankly, they don't. If you look at the context, I think it's clear that Jacob's already been changed, that his wrestling with God is a manifestation of the change that's already taken place. Look at verses 9 through 12. We see Jacob praying. And we see this incredible prayer. Let me just read it. Jacob says, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me." So Jacob's prayer is based on God's promise. "O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you." Verse 10, "I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have sworn to your servant." So there we see Jacob seeing himself as God sees him, as unworthy, as someone who God has poured out great loving kindness to, and it's undeserving. He recognizes God's grace and God's mercy. And then in verse 12, he asks for God's protection, for God's deliverance. Actually, verse 11, from Esau, "Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he will come and attack me, and the mothers with the children. For you said," then he recounts God's promise again, "I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered." So he claims the promise of God, the Abrahamic covenant. He's humble. He's definitely a changed person at this point. which is why he wrestles with God and prevails. So even though there's certainly a continuing transformation in that episode, it's not the beginning. So he's already a changed man. And then, of course, the interesting question, verse 24, is who is he wrestling with? Verse 24 calls him a man, but clearly he's more than a man, and he's not an angel. The curriculum says, scholars state that it is God or an angel carrying God's authority. That's page 82 of the curriculum. Clearly he's not an angel. Jacob confesses. Actually, God states in verse 28, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men have prevailed. And then verse 30, Jacob names the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, and my life has been preserved. So Scripture's clear. This is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. I say Jesus Christ because Jesus is the physical representation of Godhead. In the Old Testament, whenever there's a theophany, it is Jesus that is appearing. Remember, he didn't just start to exist in the incarnation. He simply came and became flesh and dwelt among us. He's God. He's eternal God. The next question is then, if he's God, how did Jacob prevail? Even if he was just an angel, how would Jacob prevail? Well, the only answer we know, the Scripture doesn't explain that, but the obvious answer is God allows him to. I think God is responding to Jacob's humility and responding to Jacob's desire to be blessed, and therefore honoring him with this. Obviously, if he didn't prevail, God would kill him, because that's how God's all powerful, right? So, anyways, God then asked Jacob in verse 27, what is your name? Why would he ask him that? Well, Jesus does the same thing in the New Testament. He asks questions he knows the answers to, because the benefit is for the person answering. And of course, as Jacob says what his name is, his name means supplanter or deceiver. It's kind of a reminding him of who he was. But now God is going to give a very a great illustration, or he's going to change his name to show him what his future is and what the transformation that was taking place in his life. He says, you're not going to be Jacob anymore, you're going to be Israel, which literally means God, or means striving with God. One thing I just want to clarify in explaining the connection between Jacob and his sons and the nation of Israel, the curriculum has some fuzzy wording. On page 86, it writes this: these descendants later entered the promised land and became citizens of the nation of the kingdom of Israel. That statement makes it sound like Israel already existed as a nation, and Jacob's sons went and joined it. They became citizens. They didn't become citizens. They were the children of Israel, literally Jacob. They become, as they multiply, as their descendants multiply, they become Israel. So you may say, well, that's just a fine point. No, I don't think it is. I think it's a very confusing statement to say they became citizens. Instead of what's really happening here is that they are becoming a nation through their multiplication. Along with this incredible blessing that God gives Jacob in this divine encounter, Jacob is given a permanent injury as they wrestle and God reaches out. Jesus reaches out, touches his thigh. He will then forever limp as a reminder of this event. It's very similar to what God does to Paul. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul has this incredible revelation. He goes up to the third heaven and sees things there that he cannot speak about. And he says in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9, so to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And that's exactly what we have with Jacob. He has this incredible experience, something no other human beings ever encountered and experienced. And so God humbles him a little bit and causes him to always remember who he was, and now the blessings of what God has done for him by giving him this limp, this permanent injury, so to speak. That though it heals, it still leaves him with this limp. It's not like he's in pain the rest of his life, but he has this constant reminder of what God has done for him. Also, just be sure as we close to look at the summary applications on page 88. We always want to be making applications and showing them how this applies to them, and they give 3 good ones there on page 88. You can look at those up and see those. So I hope you have a great lesson, and we'll see you on Sunday.